This morning, we continue with the series, Your Story Starts Here. And we're talking about our story starting in the midst of God's story. So last week, we talked about that idea of our story starting in God's story. This morning, the subtitle of the sermon is Patterns. Now, if you have been in teaching for the last 20 or so years, or if you have been in school, or if you've had children who have been in school, you know that there's a lot of talk among the children about patterns because they are consciously taught to identify patterns. Now, we did that when I was growing up too, back in the day, but I don't remember it ever being called that or identified as such. I don't know what we called it, but I know that we were always looking for patterns. And a lot of children's games look for patterns. What's the sequence? What's the pattern? How do these things flow? And I'm aware that when I was little, I had this idea of patterns in my head. And because I work inside my head so much and don't say things out loud, some people think out loud and kind of work things out, but I do it in my head, and then eventually when I come to whatever my final answer is, I'll say it out loud, and then maybe get corrected on it. But I had it all worked out it was probably my preschool head. I had it all worked out as part of the baby boomer generation, and having heard the stories from my grandparents and my parents about World War I and World War II, and I thought that there was a pattern here, that every 20 years we would fight a war against the Germans, the war would last 4 years, and we would win. I just thought that was the pattern, and that was the way things were, and that was the way things ever should be, until I got a little bit older and realized that no, that wasn't actually a pattern, and that it didn't actually work that way. But I also, growing up as a seventh generation Methodist, I had an idea about church life and the way that worked. We were part of a small church, and every 4 years seemed like clockwork. I tend to work on these 4-year cycles. Do you notice that? But every 4 years we would get a new pastor, and one 4-year period, it would be a pastor who was pretty strong and good and did well. And for the other 4 years, it would be a pastor who wasn't so strong and didn't do so well. And then they'd send another one who was pretty good. And so what we lost during one would come up during the other. And I also had the idea that all pastors' wives looked alike. The pastors didn't. I could tell a difference in the pastors, but the pastors' wives I had seen pretty much looked alike. And the one who was the mother-in-law of my uncle, she looked pretty much the same. The wife of the pastor at my little church when we first went there, they all, I think, went to the same hairdresser and had the same hair coloring. They were all about the same height, and they all had the glasses that kind of went like this a little bit. You know, kind of a little, just not real cat eye, but just a little bit of a point here. And then we got a pastor who had a wife who didn't look like that at all. So it broke that pattern. And as I got older, I realized, no, that 4-year thing is not a definite deal. That's just somebody's decision, and it affected our particular church in that particular way, but it isn't an everlasting pattern. But you know, you get it in your head that there are these patterns, and that's the way things are, until something happens that breaks that image for you, or you get a little bit more awareness and you realize, no, that isn't a have to be, and we're not trapped by those patterns. Well, one of the parts of being emotionally healthy as a person, as a family, as a church, as a community, is to identify patterns and to consciously decide, yes, for the patterns that are good and that serve us well, and realize that we don't have to continue the patterns that are unhealthy or negative or harmful. And I'm not going to read you the whole of the patriarch's story in Genesis. Most of you are fairly familiar with it. But if you go through and read the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, you see patterns there. There are patterns of lying and deceit in order to get out of trouble or to work one's own advantage or to further one's own ambition. There are patterns of favoritism, one child over another, and there are patterns of cutting off of relationships and just not dealing with one another. There are many negative patterns that play out over the generations and that play out over the centuries to create things that are not good and not healthy for that family of patriarchs and for the people of God. But there are also some patterns that are positive patterns. There are patterns of faithfulness to God and of relationship with God and of listening to God. And the people who pick up on those patterns and who continue them continue to bring goodness out of brokenness, continue to bring wholeness out of that which is limited, continue to bring forgiveness and reconciliation out of things that are stressed and strained and relationships that are not good. So you see those patterns too, those patterns of faithfulness. And those are the patterns that are the salvation of the people of God and the family of God. So the scripture for this morning is a part of that story. And this is when we get down to Jacob, or Israel's sons, his 12 sons. There was also a pattern of multiple wives and concubines and all that stuff, and that tended not to work out well. So this is a pattern I don't recommend us taking up and repeating, okay? But the story of Joseph is that he was the favorite, and very clearly the favorite of his father, and very obviously the favorite son, even though he was number 11 out of 12. He was the favorite because he was the first son of the favorite wife. His brothers, as we might understand, could not stand him. It's bad enough that somebody's the favorite. That tends to get you in trouble with your siblings. But he was apparently a person of no guile. He didn't realize that telling his brothers and everybody else the truth about what he saw in the future and how God was speaking to him, he didn't realize that was problematic for his siblings. When he told them stories about dreams he had where he was going to be in charge and they would be bowing down to him, they were not impressed. They were not pleased. And where even his parents were bowing down to him. He's just telling them what he saw, but you and I, we wouldn't like that. We wouldn't like it if somebody were telling us those stories. So his brothers did what was the family pattern. Acting on jealousy and anger, they decided that they would be rid of Joseph. And when they had opportunity, they talked about killing him. But Reuben talked them out, the older brother, talked them out of doing that, and instead they sold him to a caravan that was passing by. And then they killed an animal and took the coat that Dad had given him and put the animal's blood on it and took it back to Dad and didn't quite lie. They said, "Isn't this Joseph's coat?" And from there, Jacob made the assumption that Joseph had been killed by wild animals, and he mourned the loss of his son. So the family goes on doing their thing. Joseph is taken into slavery, and because he continues to be just upright and honest, and he doesn't follow that family pattern at all, except the part that's faithfulness and holding steady with God. And he gets into some scrapes in Egypt and ends up in prison and has some encounters with people that are close to Pharaoh, interprets their dreams for them, and eventually the one of the two he interprets for one of those guys when things are starting to be troubling to Pharaoh, when Pharaoh is having some dreams that bother him. Then that cupbearer remembers Joseph in prison and says, I know a guy. I know a guy. He's in jail and he can interpret dreams. So Pharaoh calls him out, and Joseph interprets the dream, and Pharaoh ends up putting Joseph in charge of all of the grain in production, and Joseph becomes the number 2 man in Egypt, and oversees this program that keeps the people of Egypt from starving when the famine comes, and even serves the people who are beyond. There was famine in the area where Jacob, Israel, and the rest of the family lived, and they heard about the granaries in Egypt being full. So the sons, except the youngest one, Benjamin, the second favorite son, all of them were sent to Egypt to see if they could get some grain and bring it back home so that the family wouldn't starve. The person they had to see for that was Joseph. They didn't recognize him because he was wearing an Egypt getup, and he had gotten older, and he was looking all Egyptian, and they called him by something other than Joseph. And so they didn't recognize him, but he recognized them. And if he had stayed true to family pattern, the negative part of family pattern, he could have done all kinds of things to them. He puts them to the test. He puts them to the test, but he helps them. And he sees that they bring his younger brother Benjamin back, that they have to make a trip home and then come back and bring Benjamin with them. They still haven't recognized him. And so we pick up the story at chapter 45, where Joseph is talking to his brothers. Joseph could no longer control himself in front of all his attendants, so he declared, "Everyone, leave now." So no one stayed with him when he revealed his identity to his brothers. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians and Pharaoh's household heard him. Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm Joseph. Is my father really still alive?" His brothers couldn't respond because they were terrified before him. Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me," and they moved closer. He said, "I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold to Egypt. Now don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves that you sold me here. Actually, God sent me before you to save lives. We've already had 2 years of famine in the land, and there are 5 years left without planting or harvesting. God sent me before you to make sure you'd survive and to rescue your lives in this amazing way. You didn't send me here. It was God who made me a father to Pharaoh, master of his entire household, and ruler of the whole land of Egypt. Hurry, go back to your father. Tell him this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me master of all of Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You may live in the land of Goshen, so you will be near me, your children, your grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, and everyone with you. I will support you there, so you, your household, and everyone with you won't starve, since the famine will last 5 years. You and my brother Benjamin have seen with your own eyes that I'm speaking to you. Tell my father about my power in Egypt and about everything you've seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." He threw his arms around his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his shoulder. He kissed all of his brothers and wept, embracing them. After that, his brothers were finally able to talk to him. And they go back, and they bring Jacob, Israel, and all of Israel's household to Egypt, where they thrive and prosper for 400 years. We don't have to follow patterns of lying or abuse or hurt or jealousy. We don't have to perpetuate those patterns in our own lives and in the lives of future generations. If we choose instead to take the things that are the good patterns, if there are any, some families I know that's maybe hard to find, but we take the patterns that are good, or we find good patterns for ourselves from looking at other people, from looking at the way other families and churches and communities operate and function. And in finding those good patterns, we transform what has been a negative, and we take what other people perhaps intended for ill, or perhaps were doing just out of habit and out of ignorance of the possibility of change, doing out of deep-seated hurt. We can take that and we can, by the power of the Holy Spirit, allow it to be transformed. So as you think about your own family, go back as many generations as you know and think, what are some of the things that maybe were negatives in the way we functioned together? Or negative situations from my parents' families of origin. And how did those get brought forward? Or how did those get stopped? Perhaps your parents were pattern breakers and maintainers of good patterns, or creators of new patterns that were positive. Perhaps you have done that in your life and the lives of your children. Perhaps that is still to do in the lives of our families. I know that's true for me. There are things that I am still working on transforming. One of the things I thought was neat about the flowers, when they arrived, the white carnations were already pretty much open, and you take them all out and you fix them and you do stuff, and you give them 24 hours to finish opening up. And the white ones, this morning when I looked at them, it's been almost 48 hours now, white ones when I looked at them were pretty much open, pretty much done. But a lot of the red ones haven't opened fully yet. And for me, that's kind of a metaphor. Those of us who are still around in this life still have opportunity to bloom some more, to open up some more, to blossom some more. And to maybe say to our children, to our grandchildren, to our parents, words of reconciliation, words of love, to develop patterns that are healthy and positive, and to seek the will of God above our own will. Every time I look at my own life, or I look at the lives of other people in the world and other people's stories, and see things that are really hurtful and painful and problematic, it's because the focus is on the self instead of on our Lord. because we're looking to what hurts me, what helps me, what works for me, instead of how I am part of a bigger picture that God has painted and is painting. And the picture that God paints is a picture of beauty, and a picture of life, and a picture of forgiveness, and a picture of wholeness and reconciliation. So Joseph opens wide the doors of his heart. And even though his brothers have a hard time realizing and accepting the forgiveness that they don't deserve, Joseph gives it. Even though we have a hard time opening ourselves to the forgiveness that we don't deserve from God, God offers it. God gives it. And it is there for our claiming. Healthy patterns. Breaking the ones that are unhealthy, the ones that are harmful, and instead adopting the patterns that lead to life, that lead to love, that lead to God. If you have business with God this morning, if you want to come to the altar and spend some time in prayer, if you want to come and become a part of this congregation by transfer or by profession of faith, if today is the day that you need to say to God, this part of